4 bridges. In a single week, 4 of the spans that carry Russia's war into occupied Crimea have been hit. And tonight, the 17th of June, not one of them is moving military traffic the way it did a month ago. Chonhar, Henichesk, Armyansk, Krasnoperekopsk. Names most Americans have never heard, and that's exactly the point, because those 4 crossings are the arteries, and somebody in Kiev has spent the last 3 weeks methodically cutting them one at a time. This isn't a raid, it's not a symbolic strike for the cameras, it's a plan, stated out loud, being executed in front of the entire world, and the man running it told Reuters in plain language what he intends to do. He said Ukraine will isolate Crimea in the near future. And the unsettling part isn't the threat, it's that the map is starting to agree with him. This is your host Alex, and if you want to follow this story as it actually unfolds instead of 3 news cycles late, take 1 second and subscribe, because what's happening on this peninsula is going to reshape the next phase of this war. Now let me show you why. Start with what Crimea actually is, because the headlines flatten it into a piece of contested land, and it's so much more than that. For 4 years, Crimea has been the single most important logistics platform Russia has in the south. It's not just territory Moscow annexed in 2014 and wants to keep. It's the base. It's the warehouse. It's the fuel depot, the staging ground, the launch pad for everything Russia throws at the Kherson and Zaporizhia fronts. When Russian forces push in the south, the ammunition, the diesel, the spare parts, the men, a huge share of it flows out of Crimea first. Take Crimea out of the equation, and you haven't just taken a peninsula. You've pulled the floor out from under an entire front. And that is precisely what Ukraine appears to be trying to do. Not by storming it, by starving it. Here's the logic, and it's almost surgical in its patience. Russia keeps Crimea supplied through 3 channels. The first is the Kerch Bridge, Putin's prize, the longest bridge in Europe, $3.5 billion of concrete and steel and national pride connecting the peninsula directly to Russian soil. The second is the sea, shipments across the Black Sea into Sevastopol and the southern ports. And the third is the overland route, the highways and rail lines that run through the occupied territories along the Sea of Azov, the land corridor Russia carved out in the first months of the war, specifically so it would never again depend on that one vulnerable bridge. 3 lifelines. And right now, Ukraine is squeezing all 3 at once. Think about what that means. You don't have to destroy a country's military to defeat it in a region. You have to make it impossible to keep that military fed. An army that can't move fuel can't move. An army that can't move can't attack. And an army that can't attack starts losing the initiative it spent years and tens of thousands of lives to build. That's the theory. The question, the one I keep circling back to, is whether the theory is finally meeting reality on the ground. Because for the first time in this war, the answer might be yes. Let me give you the number that stopped me. The commander of Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, call sign Magyar, real name Robert Brovdy, told Reuters that 71% of Russian military cargo traffic moves along a single highway, the R280. They call it the Novorossiya route. 71%. That's not a supply line. That's a choke point wearing the costume of a highway. And once you understand that almost 3/4 of everything Russia needs in that theater funnels down one road, you understand why the bridges along it suddenly matter more than any tank battle. You don't need to win the front. You need to win the road. And the road has fewer than a dozen places where it has to cross water. So that's what they hit. The Chonhar Bridge, part of the R280 corridor, gone in the functional sense. The crossing near Henichesk, linking to the Arabat Spit, traffic halted. Armyansk, Krasnoperekopsk, struck on consecutive nights. And here's the detail that tells you this is engineering, not anger. When Russia tries to reroute around the damage, the detour pushes traffic onto roads that run closer to the front line, closer to the line of contact, deeper into the range of the very drones doing the hitting. Every workaround makes the next strike easier. Every repair invites another bomb. The Ukrainians have a phrase for this: fire control. The ability to hit a target again and again, to stop it from ever being rebuilt, to turn a bridge into a place where bridges simply cannot exist anymore. They're not knocking out the crossings, they're occupying them with the threat of fire. And the math of the detour is brutal in a way that doesn't make headlines, but wins wars. When you force a supply convoy to take the long way around, and we're talking an extra 80, 100 kilometers, a single truck can carry roughly 30% less per day. 30%. Not because the truck got smaller, because it spends those hours driving instead of delivering, and then driving back. Multiply that across thousands of vehicles, across weeks, across a front that's already starved for personnel, and you get something that looks less like a battle and more like slow suffocation. Fewer assaults, less artillery, quieter guns. Not because the Russians chose restraint, because the diesel didn't show up. Now hold that thought, because the fuel piece is where this story stops being about Ukraine and Russia and starts being about something that should matter to anyone in this country who's ever watched a number tick up at a gas pump. Inside Crimea right now, there is a fuel crisis. Not a shortage, a crisis. Reporting on the ground describes the worst gasoline situation the peninsula has seen since Russia illegally annexed it in 2014. Lines at the stations, purchase restrictions, the occupation authorities rationing how much you can buy. And the timing could not be worse for Moscow, because this is happening as Russia rolls into its summer holiday season, the start of the vacation months, when Crimea's beaches and resorts are supposed to fill with tourists, and the region is supposed to look prosperous and permanent and Russian. Instead, the picture coming out is cars idling in queues, and a population being told to stock up while they can. That's not the image of a peninsula Moscow has conquered. That's the image of a peninsula Moscow is struggling to hold. And it's not an accident of one bad week. The pressure has been building, and the slope is steep. Ukraine's strikes on Russian logistics in May exceeded April's by roughly 50%. June is on track to set a record. Read that again. This isn't plateauing, it's accelerating. The drone campaign isn't a series of one-off spectaculars. It's an industrial process that's scaling, getting more efficient, getting more precise, hunting fuel tankers on highways Russia once considered safe and leaving them burning by the dozen along the roadside. The land corridor Russia built specifically to be the secure alternative to the Kerch Bridge. That corridor is now a shooting gallery. But here's where it widens out, and here's why I'm telling you about a peninsula in the Black Sea on a finance channel. Because the fuel crisis isn't confined to Crimea. The same campaign that's hitting bridges is reaching far deeper, into Russia itself. Refineries, oil depots, pipelines. Ukrainian drones have been striking the machinery of Russia's energy economy hundreds of kilometers behind the front, and the Washington-based Institute for the Study of War flagged the synergy directly. The long-range strikes deep inside Russia and the close strikes choking Crimea are reinforcing each other. Hit the refinery, and there's less fuel to send. Hit the bridge, and what fuel there is can't get through. It's a pincer, and the thing it's squeezing is the lifeblood of the Russian state, oil and gas revenue. You know what oil is to Russia. It's not an export. It's the budget. It's the war. It's the thing that pays the soldiers and builds the drones and keeps the lights on in a country under sanctions. And when a country's refineries are getting hit faster than it can repair them, when its own domestic fuel supply starts wobbling, when the export volumes that fund the entire enterprise come under pressure, that's not a local story. That ripples. It ripples into global energy markets, into the risk premium that traders price into every barrel, into the calculations of anyone, anywhere, who fills a tank or runs a factory or builds a budget around the price of crude. A war that degrades one of the world's largest oil producers from the inside is not a regional war. It's a market event that happens to be fought with drones. I want to be careful here, because precise oil prices move by the hour, and I'm not going to pretend I can quote you a number that'll still be true by the time you're watching this. But the direction of the pressure is unmistakable. Every facility that burns, every export that's delayed, every barrel that can't make it to a tanker is a small subtraction from the one revenue stream that lets Russia keep doing this. The Ukrainians understand that better than anyone. They've said it out loud. They're making Moscow pay an economic cost for the war. They're not just trying to win on the battlefield. They're trying to bankrupt the war effort that feeds it. And the slowest, surest way to lose a war is to run out of the money to fight it. So step back with me for a second. What we're actually watching is a strategy that attacks the war on three planes at once. On the tactical plane, you have bridges down and convoys rerouted and assaults thinning out for lack of supply. On the operational plane, you have an entire front, the southern front, being undercut as its supply base in Crimea turns from an asset into a liability. And on the strategic plane, you have the Russian war economy itself taking damage, refinery by refinery, barrel by barrel. 3 planes, one coherent idea. And the man who articulated it didn't hedge. Brovdi said Ukraine isn't planning to storm Crimea. Read that carefully because it's the most important sentence in this whole story. They're not planning an amphibious assault, not planning to send infantry across the water under fire to plant a flag. The plan is quieter and frankly scarier for Moscow. The plan is to make it impossible for Russia to stay, to choke the peninsula until the cost of holding it exceeds whatever value it still has, to turn Putin's most prized trophy into his most expensive burden. And you cannot defend against that with tanks. There's no front line to hold. The attack is on logistics, on physics, on the simple, ugly arithmetic of how far a truck can drive on a tank of diesel. Now, does any of this mean the Southern Front is about to collapse tomorrow? I want to be honest with you, because the analysts I trust are not, and you deserve the real version, not the hyped one. The Institute for the Study of War didn't say the front is collapsing. What it said is more measured and, in a way, more ominous. Continued strikes on Russia's ground lines of communication will likely have cascading battlefield effects and may complicate Russia's preparations for offensive operations. Cascading. That's the word. Not a sudden break, a cascade. One failure feeding the next. The bridge goes, so the detour gets longer. So the truck delivers less. So the fuel runs short. So the assault gets postponed. So the initiative slips. So the men hold positions they can't properly supply. So the whole structure starts to sag under its own weight. Collapse isn't usually a moment. It's a process that at some point becomes visible all at once. And what we may be watching is the early, quiet part of that process, the part that happens before the world notices. That's the part nobody can fully see yet. Whether this is the beginning of something decisive or just another painful season in a war that's already grinding into its 5th year, I don't know. Anyone who tells you they know for certain is selling you something. But I'll tell you what makes this different from the dozens of other times we've heard Crimea is being cut off. This time, the Ukrainians have the range. They have the production. They have the drones, built at home, in numbers that didn't exist 2 years ago, and they've stated a specific operational goal and started checking the boxes on it in sequence. Intent plus capability plus a target that can't be defended the normal way. That combination is what makes a military analyst sit up. And here's the loop I opened earlier and never quite closed. The 71%. Sit with that figure one more time. Russia, 4 years into a war it expected to win in a week, has allowed almost 3/4 of its military cargo in this theater to depend on a single highway with a handful of bridges. That's not a sign of strength. That's a vulnerability that was always there, hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to build the weapon that could reach it. And now someone has. The bridges were always the weak point. It just took until 2026 for Ukraine to have the tools to prove it. Which brings us north. Because the most telling reaction to all of this didn't come from Moscow. Moscow's been quiet, and that silence is its own kind of statement. The most telling reaction came from a man who has spent the entire war as Russia's most loyal accomplice, and who, 2 days ago, did something nobody expected. Alexander Lukashenko, the ruler of Belarus. The leader who, in February 2022, let Russian troops pour across his territory to attack Kyiv, who has hosted Russian troops and missiles, and signed a treaty pulling his country under Moscow's nuclear umbrella. That Lukashenko. On the 15th of June, in an interview with Al Arabiya, he did something that would have been unthinkable a year ago. He apologized to Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, the leader of the country his patron is trying to destroy. He apologized for his own past insults, and then he said the quiet part with a candor that frankly startled me. He said Belarus is very vulnerable militarily. And then he explained why, and the explanation is the whole story in one sentence. He said everything in Belarus is in plain sight of the Ukrainian military. Everything. In plain sight. This is a man looking at the exact same drones that are burning bridges in Crimea and doing the math for his own country and not liking the answer. He said drawing Belarus into the war would be unacceptable, said he and Putin both consider it absolutely unacceptable, and he urged Kiev, in almost paternal language, to calm down. Why now? Why this sudden conciliation from a man who spent 4 years sneering? Because the deterrent got real. Earlier this year, Ukrainian officials, Bravdi again, the same commander, referenced something on the order of 500 targets identified inside Belarus. 500. Air bases, rail hubs, fuel infrastructure, command facilities. Lukashenko heard that, and at first he mocked it. Suggested Zelensky must have smoked something, injected something. Tough talk. And then, somewhere between then and now, he watched what those same Ukrainian drones did to a peninsula that Russia thought was secure, and the tough talk evaporated into an apology. That's not a change of heart. That's a survival calculation. He looked at Crimea, and he saw Belarus. And this is the thread that ties the whole thing together. The thing I want you to walk away holding. Ukraine's deep strike capability isn't just winning bridges. It's rewriting the political geometry of the entire region. When you can credibly threaten to do to Belarus what you're doing to Crimea, you don't have to fire a single shot at Minsk to change Minsk's behavior. The deterrent does the work. Lukashenko's apology isn't sentiment. It's the sound of deterrence functioning in real time, broadcast on Al Arabiya for anyone paying attention. Now, I'm going to push back on my own story for a second, because that's the job. It would be easy to spin this into a triumphant narrative where Russia is crumbling and the war is nearly won, and that's not what the evidence supports. Even Lukashenko, in the same interview where he apologized, said something sober, that Russian forces are still making progress, grinding forward step by step, and that Ukraine is suffering badly from a shortage of personnel. Both of those things are true at the same time. Ukraine can be winning the logistics war in the south and still be stretched dangerously thin on manpower across the whole front. Russia can be losing its grip on Crimea's supply lines and still be advancing meters a day somewhere in the east. War is not a single scoreboard. It's a dozen scoreboards, and they don't all read the same way. Anyone who shows you only the favorable ones is telling you a story, not the truth. But, and this is the but that matters, even Lukashenko no longer sees a quick Russian victory. The man whose entire foreign policy is built on betting correctly on Moscow is hedging. He's urging compromise. He's floating the idea that the war could end this year. And when the most reliable weather vane in Eastern Europe starts turning, it's worth asking which way the wind is actually blowing. He's not turning because he's grown a conscience. He's turning because the cost-benefit math of being Russia's accomplice is shifting, and he can feel it shifting, and self-preservation is the only ideology he's ever really had. So let me bring it back to where we started, to those 4 bridges, and to why this is bigger than any single span of concrete. What you're really watching in the South is a test of an idea. The idea that in 2026, a country with enough drones and enough patience and enough precision can defeat a much larger military, not by beating it in open battle, but by dismantling the boring, unglamorous, absolutely essential machinery that keeps it fed. No grand offensive, no cinematic breakthrough, just bridges that won't carry trucks, fuel that won't reach the front, refineries that won't stop burning, and an enemy slowly discovering that its greatest strategic asset has become a 40,000 square kilometer liability it can't defend and can't abandon. And if that idea works, if you really can isolate a peninsula the size of Crimea by strangling its supply lines from the air, then the implications run far past this one war. Every military planner on Earth is watching. Every general who built a strategy around big bases and long supply lines and the assumption that the rear is safe is, right now, recalculating. The rear isn't safe anymore. The bridge isn't safe. The refinery isn't safe. The thing that made you strong, your concentration, your infrastructure, your logistics hub, is the exact thing a few hundred cheap drones can turn against you. That's the lesson Crimea is teaching in real time, and it's a lesson that will outlive this war by decades. For an American audience, here's why you can't file this under over there. The price of oil is set on a global market, and Russia is one of its largest suppliers, and a campaign that's deliberately degrading Russian energy infrastructure from the inside is a structural pressure on that market, whether or not it makes the front page here. The stability of Europe, your largest collective trading partner, the anchor of the alliance system this country has spent 80 years building, turns on how this war ends. And the credibility of deterrence itself, the whole concept that the threat of overwhelming retaliation keeps the peace, is being stress-tested live by a country that just got the most reliable strongman in the region to apologize to the very leader he helped try to destroy. None of that is abstract. All of it eventually shows up in a price, a policy, or a headline you can't ignore. I keep coming back to the silence from Moscow. Lukashenko talked, Ukraine talked, loudly and specifically, telling the world exactly what it intends to do to Crimea. But the Kremlin, on this, the bridges, the fuel, the slow strangulation of its prize, has been notably quiet. And in my experience, when a state that loves to broadcast its strength goes quiet about a specific vulnerability, it's not because the vulnerability is small. It's because there's no good answer. What is Moscow supposed to say? That the indestructible land corridor is being destroyed? That the peninsula it swore to defend forever is rationing gasoline at the start of tourist season? Sometimes the loudest thing in a war is the thing nobody in power will talk about. And right now, nobody in power in Russia wants to talk about the bridges. There's one more layer here, and it's the one I find hardest to shake. For 4 years, the conventional wisdom held that Crimea was the untouchable core, the one piece of territory Russia would relinquish last, if ever, the trophy of the whole invasion, the symbol Putin staked his legitimacy on. The assumption was always that everything else was negotiable, but Crimea was forever. And what this campaign is quietly proving is that forever depends entirely on being able to supply the place. Take away the diesel, take away the bridges, take away the ability to feed and fuel and arm the garrison, and forever turns out to have an expiration date written in logistics tables. The most prized possession becomes the hardest to keep. Not because anyone conquered it, because nobody could keep it fed. I don't know how this ends. I want to say that clearly because the honest answer is that the picture is still half hidden. Maybe Russia adapts, finds new routes, rebuilds faster than Ukraine can strike, absorbs the cost and holds on, the way it has held on through every other prediction of its collapse. That's happened before. The Kerch Bridge was hit in 2022, in 2023, in 2025, and every time Moscow scrambled and repaired and kept going. Don't underestimate the regime's capacity to absorb pain. But maybe, and this is the possibility that's hard to dismiss now in a way it wasn't 6 months ago, maybe this is the season where the math finally turns, where the cascade ISW described actually cascades, where the South stops being the place Russia attacks from and becomes the place Russia can no longer hold. Maybe the bridges were the keystone all along, and we're watching them get pulled, one at a time, on a timeline somebody in Kiev has clearly already planned. Here's the question I'll leave you with, and I don't have a clean answer, which is exactly why it's the right question. If Russia's entire position in the south rests on a single highway, a handful of bridges, and a fuel supply that's already cracking, and if the man in Minsk who knows Moscow best is suddenly apologizing to the enemy and quietly betting against a Russian victory, then what exactly is Russia still fighting to defend down there? A peninsula it can't supply? A front it can't feed? Or just the story that it's still winning, told a little louder each week to drown out the sound of bridges going down? Watch the bridges. They'll tell you the truth long before anyone in power admits it. This is Professor Alex. I'll see you in the next one.